In the summer of 1891, Harper Farm sat high on a wind-swept ridge at the end of Hollow Road, a place where the grass bent low in the breeze and the air carried the smell of wet wood and earth. The farm was not grand, yet it was the kind of property people spoke of as steady, because the Harpers never left it untended, never missed a season's planting, and never took part in the noise of other people's troubles. Their fences stayed mended, their fields neat, their animals fat and quiet. It was the sort of order that made neighbors nod in approval from a distance but avoid visiting without clear reason. What people noticed most, though never discussed at the table, was that the Harpers had no daughters. There were sons, 3 of them, each grown with hard hands and blank eyes, but no girls had ever been seen on that farm. The absence was not remarkable on its own. Children died, babies were lost. But in the valley, where most families had a mix of both, it became something people thought about without admitting they thought about it. The Harper place had a way of swallowing sound. Even in summer, when the fields in other parts of the valley rang with the calls of birds and the cries of livestock, Hollow Road seemed muted. A man could walk the property line and hear only the wind threading through the orchard, the creak of the barn boards, and sometimes, very faintly, a soft metallic clinking from somewhere inside. That sound, if asked about, was explained as tools shifting on their hooks or a loose latch swinging in the breeze. But those who had heard it knew it carried a strange precision, the steady, measured rhythm of something done with care. The Harpers worked their land from before dawn until the sky was black again, yet their fields were never the first to be planted nor the last to be harvested. They kept to a pace that seemed to belong to some other calendar, one not marked on paper. Mrs. Harper was the one people saw least, yet she was the thread that held the family's rhythm. In town, she moved with quiet efficiency, choosing flour and salt without pause, never asking for credit, never bargaining. Her clothes were plain and always clean, her hair bound so tightly it seemed to pull at her temples. She had a way of looking at people without ever settling her eyes on their faces, as if measuring the space they took up rather than their expressions. Once, a shopkeeper's wife noticed a faint dark smear on the hem of her apron. Not mud, not quite the red of berry juice, and the sight stayed in her mind for years without her ever finding the words to tell her husband. The barn was the largest structure on the property, taller even than the farmhouse, with double doors that were always shut and latched when strangers passed by. The Harpers kept their animals there, it was said, but no one recalled hearing the restless shifting or lowing of livestock from within. Children dared each other to run up and touch the doors, but most stopped short, unsettled by the strange chill that seemed to leak from the wood itself, even in the heat of August. The orchard behind the barn was small and tidy, its rows of apple trees pruned into careful symmetry. In late summer, the fruit hung heavy and sweet, but the Harpers never sold it in town. Whatever they harvested from those trees stayed on the ridge. The townsfolk liked to think the Harpers were simply private, bound by some old-fashioned notion of family that left no room for outsiders. It was easier to believe that than to question why no one had ever seen a girl playing in the yard, why no neighbor had been invited to a christening or a birthday, why the stories about missing girls from towns along the river always ended with no trail to follow. Those thoughts lived in the private corners of people's minds, tucked away with other discomforts until they almost seemed imagined. And yet on still nights when the wind carried just right, a person walking Hollow Road could swear they heard something in the orchard. A sound that was not the rustle of leaves nor the call of any bird, but something quieter, closer and far more deliberate. Something that did not belong in a place the neighbors still called respectable. And in that stillness, the Harper farm waited, holding its secrets as it had for years. The soil behind the barn packed smooth and undisturbed, the kind of soil that might hide more than roots if anyone were foolish enough to look. The census taker had not meant to come this far up Hollow Road. His route was meant to turn back toward the river. But the weathered track had drawn him on, the kind of mistake made without noticing until the air shifted and the sound of the valley fell away. The Harper place rose ahead through the haze, the long slope of the barn roof catching the pale light, the orchard beyond it still as a painted backdrop. He had heard the name before in lists and ledgers. Harper, with 3 sons and no mention of daughters, and knew them as the sort who answered questions with as few words as possible. He walked up the path, boots crunching on gravel, the house shuttered tight though the day was warm. No one answered his knock, but from the corner of his eye, the barn caught his attention. Its double doors were shut, but a gap in the warped wood near the back let through a sliver of movement. It was not the restless shift of an animal. He stepped closer without thinking, his footfalls soft in the grass, and leaned toward the slats. Inside, the light was dim, dust drifting like a slow mist. For a moment he saw nothing, and then something pale swayed into view, not skin, not quite, but fabric, thin and worn, tied to a beam so it hung like a strip of faded ribbon. Beyond it, a shape moved, small, quick, deliberate. He could tell by the angle of its head and the way it turned to the side that it was a child, but the shadow was too slender for a boy, the hair too long, the posture too still. Then came the sound, not loud, not even clear, but undeniably a voice. It spoke only a few words, low and almost mechanical, and though he could not make them out, the tone made the hair along his neck rise. It was not the open chatter of a child. It was a recitation, something memorized. The pale fabric shifted again, and he realized it was not loose at all, but stitched into another piece of cloth behind it, as though someone had sewn it into place on the beam. The child moved back, fading into the dark as if pulled. For a moment there was nothing, and then the sound changed, a faint scrape like metal dragged along wood in a slow arc. He had heard that sound before in a different life, when he watched a coffin lid being planned to fit. It was the same steady rhythm, the same grim patience. He stepped back, heart thudding now, telling himself it could be nothing. Some cousin's girl staying with the family, an innocent thing, perhaps even his eyes playing tricks. But the barn door shuddered once, not from wind but from within, as if something had shifted against it. He turned away then, moving quickly down the path toward the road, telling himself he still had other farms to record before dusk. Yet his ledger stayed blank for the Harpers, the page marked only with their name and the space where numbers should have been. As he walked away, the air behind him seemed to close, the stillness of the ridge settling back into place. The barn doors were shut tight once more, and from the road it looked like nothing had moved at all. But in the shadows within, the pale fabric hung still, marking the place where something small had stood, watching, until the stranger was gone. And the census taker would not know until years later that on that warm afternoon he had been the last outsider to see movement behind those walls before the ground behind the barn began to change shape. The farmhand arrived in late September when the mornings were sharp with frost and the orchard behind the barn had begun to drop its first apples. He came from 2 counties over, answering word of a short-term harvest job. The pay was poor, but he needed the coins, and the Harpers were known, at least in distant talk, for keeping work steady. They met him at the gate, the eldest son standing stiff with arms crossed, the father behind him silent. The mother never came out. He was given no tour, no welcome, only the tools and the expectation he would rise before the sun. For the first days he kept his head down, pulling fruit from the trees, stacking baskets, hauling them to the barn where someone inside would take them without a word and shut the doors again. He noticed early that no other workers were present, just him and the Harper men, who seemed always to be moving something heavy behind those barn doors. It was on the third morning that he saw the stones. They were not part of the orchard rows nor near the fence line, but in a narrow strip of grass between the barn's rear wall and the first apple tree. 5 flat stones, each the size of a dinner plate, pressed neatly into the soil. They did not stick up like markers, but lay flush, as though meant to be walked over without a stumble. Their edges were sharp for something supposedly weathered by years outdoors, and their surfaces were bare. No moss, no lichen, no names. At first he thought they covered roots, but the ground beneath them seemed wrong, the grass around them darker, as if the soil itself had been turned not long ago and pressed back down with care. That afternoon, while the Harper men hauled baskets elsewhere, he lingered near the stones. He bent to touch one and felt the faint give beneath it, not loose, but not anchored in earth the way a stone should be. He pressed harder, and the scent that rose was not rot, but something metallic, sharp and dry, like iron that had been wet and left to rest. He stepped back quickly, glancing toward the barn. But no one had seen. The stillness of the ridge seemed to lean in around him as if listening. That night, lying in the narrow cot in the loft of the farmhouse, he heard a steady, rhythmic sound from beyond the orchard. A dull thud spaced evenly apart, like someone driving a stake into soil at the same point over and over. On the 6th day, he decided he would not stay. He took his small pay in silence, though the eldest son told him there was more work yet. He left before dawn, walking fast toward the road, his boots striking the frozen dirt. He never told anyone about the stones, only carried the image with him. 5 shapes laid in a perfect line, holding something beneath them that was never meant to be uncovered. And in the days that followed, when the frost melted and the wind shifted, Hollow Road seemed to pull a little farther from the rest of the valley, as though drawing its secrets closer to the earth. On Sundays, when the church bell rang from the valley and the Harper men walked the mile down to service, Mrs. Harper stayed behind. In town, it was explained away as frail health or an aversion to the drafty pews, and no one pressed her for more. But on the ridge, her absence from church was part of the rhythm, as fixed as the frost on the fence rails in winter. Once the men's boots faded from earshot, she would step out of the farmhouse in her plain apron and walk toward the orchard. A wicker basket looped over her arm. From the road, if anyone had cause to pass that way, she might seem like a woman tending to early blossoms or checking for blight. Up close, there was nothing idle in her movements. She took a narrow path between the apple rows, stopping always at the same 5 flat stones behind the barn. There she would kneel, setting the basket down in the grass, and begin her work. The orchard was silent but for the sound of fabric rustling and the faint scrape of metal on stone. She would lift each flat marker with surprising ease, tilting it just enough to reach into the dark earth beneath. Sometimes she returned with nothing, only pressing the soil back into place. Other times she would lift out a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth, its shape uneven, its weight shifting in her grip. These went into the basket, never more than one at a time. From the corner of the barn, a thin shadow sometimes shifted, the slats catching a flicker of pale movement within. But she never turned toward it. When the basket was full, never more than a third of the way, she walked not to the house but around the far side of the barn, disappearing from sight for an hour or more. There, unseen from the road, stood an old water trough fed by a buried pipe from the spring. The water that pooled there was dark and still, its surface coated in a faint iridescent sheen. She would kneel beside it and open the bundles, her hands quick and practiced, and though no one had the chance to see what lay inside, the faint smell of that rose could cling in the air for days if the wind carried it toward the orchard. By the time the men returned from church, she would be back inside, the apron washed and drying by the hearth, the basket put away. The 5 stones behind the barn sat as they had before, their surfaces clean, the grass around them trimmed neat. Whatever had been moved beneath them was hidden again, the soil pressed flat under the same deliberate hand. And each week the routine went on without change. The quiet certainty of it settling over the ridge like the low clouds that sometimes refuse to lift. Those who thought of the Harper farm as a place of plain respectability never saw her work. And those who did, in rare moments of accident or mistake, found it easier to tell themselves they had misunderstood what they'd seen. It was simpler that way, and far safer. The storm came hard from the north and struck the ridge like a blunt tool, tearing at the orchard and dropping an old tree with a groan that the valley mistook for thunder. Morning showed the ground churned open behind the barn, the grass peeled back and the careful lines broken, and in that raw strip something pale pushed up where the root ball had ripped through a shallow bed. It was the father who saw it first, stepping out with a spade to fix what could be fixed and then stopping as a small corner of oiled cloth winked through the mud like a 6 star. He looked around and no one stood near, yet he moved quickly, pushing soil over the pale edge with the back of the spade, tamping it flat with the heel of his boot, whispering a prayer that was not about mercy but about silence. By noon the sun warmed the churned earth and a neighbor riding past smelled iron where rain should have lingered, and he tugged his horse forward and did not look left because the barn doors were closed and the ridge was watching. That night the wind shifted again, and the tree, now laid on its side with roots like a torn hand, settled into a deeper lean and dragged more soil with it, and the oiled cloth unrolled enough to show the shape of a small shoulder. The eldest son found it at dawn and called to his mother without raising his voice, because in that house everything was done as if the walls had ears. She came out with the basket she used on Sundays and the thin knife she kept for string and cloth, and she did not gasp or cross herself. She only knelt and began to work the mud away with her fingers, slow and steady, as if untying a knot. The father stood with the spade and the sons formed a wall that hid the scene from the road, and the mother slipped the knife under the cloth and freed what lay within, and the smell that rose was not rot but something clean and metallic, like a room wiped down and left to dry. It was a girl, or what was left of a girl, bound tight in layers of fabric stitched with rows of tiny knots that followed the lines of her ribs and hips, each knot labeled with a small tag of twine inked in symbols that looked like crooked stars. Her skin, where it showed, bore shallow lines so precise they seemed measured with a rule, crossing and recrossing in a pattern that mapped the body like a field divided for planting. Along her arms the lines curved into loops and spirals that met at the soft crook of the elbow, and at each meeting point a seed bead had been pressed into the skin and left there to heal around it, making a rosary the flesh had swallowed. Someone had worked for hours, days, maybe longer, so that the pattern could be read like a chart by the same hands that made it. In the hollow of the throat, a small disc of tin was sewn to the cloth with hair as thread, and on the tin a number was scratched. Not a name, but a count. They carried the girl into the barn where the light did not travel and the air stayed still, and the father pushed the doors shut with his back and slid the heavy bar across. Inside, on a table built from old fence boards, scrubbed pale, lay a row of jars with wire bales and glass stoppers, each jar holding something that looked like the inside of a flower pressed flat and labeled with those same crooked stars. The mother set the girl down and began untying the knots, not to free her, but to count them. And as she counted, she hummed, and the hum matched the rhythm of the storm the night before, a steady beat like rain on a roof. The father opened one jar and then another, and the room filled with the faint sting of spirits, and he dipped a rag and wiped the lines on the girl's skin until the pattern showed even clearer, red rising to meet the air as if called by a name. The sun stood without moving, their faces as blank as new boards, and one of them held the ledger, its pages already marked with dates and measures, and he touched the pencil to the paper each time their mother reached a turning point in the design. The girl had no teeth left, only small carved slivers set into the gums, each sliver carved with the letter of an animal and placed to make a circle, as if the mouth were a cage meant to keep something in. Her hair was cut close, not shaved, and the cuttings were braided into 5 tight cords that had been nailed to a board and then removed, leaving small holes in the plank that still smelled of sap. The mother's hands did not shake. She spoke once, but not to the men. She spoke to the pattern, saying it was almost right this time, that the storm had been early, that the roots had not respected the line. The father wiped the girl's cheek again until the spiral at the edge of her jaw brightened like a fresh mark on a map. He told the eldest to fetch the small hammer and the thin nails kept in the blue tin, and the boy went without a sound and came back with the tin open like an offering. They worked in silence for an hour and then another, adjusting and recording, measuring with twine, holding the twine against the carved numbers on the beam. When they were done, the mother wrapped the girl in clean cloth, not to hide her but to pause her, and they carried her to the narrow room behind the wall where the jars lived. The father went back to the orchard and cut the roots of the fallen tree into lengths and stacked them. And then he filled the torn bed with fresh soil and laid the stone back flat, pressing the grass around it with his open hand until no ridge showed. By evening the ridge was quiet again, the storm far away, the barn doors dark against the last light. Down in the valley, the neighbor who had smelled iron told his wife he had felt a chill pass over him in the saddle, and she told him it was the weather. And he nodded and agreed because it was easier and safer to say weather than anything else. On the ridge, the mother washed her hands in a pan and poured the water into the trough where a faint sheen floated and then broke, and she watched it break as if reading an answer she already knew. She went inside and folded the empty oiled cloth and placed it in the pantry behind the jars where no one looked unless told to look. The ledger stayed open on the table until the ink dried, and then the eldest shut it and slid it behind the row of jars so the crooked stars on their labels looked like a shield. The house settled for the night and the wind turned gentle, and the orchard smelled like bruised fruit and rain. Behind the barn the stone lay as it had before, neat and plain, and the ground around it looked smooth enough to step on without catching a toe. No one did. The road below held its silence, and the storm's gift was hidden again, tucked back into the system that had held for years. The pattern would continue because order was the law in that house, and because the storm had not stopped anything so much as showed how close work lived to the surface. It was not until more of the orchard was opened that the true scope of the Harper method came into focus. The second grave gave up a girl so unlike the first that at first glance they could have been from different hands, yet the same quiet precision ran through every mark, as if the work was part of one long design only visible when laid side by side. Her hair had been taken in its entirety but not discarded. It hung in dozens of miniature braids nailed to a length of weathered board, each braid tipped with a bead carved from applewood. Each bead scorched black on one side as if passed quickly through flame. The braids were arranged in a slow spiral, starting at the center of the board and winding outward, the pattern so careful it made the breath catch to look at it. The scalp beneath had been treated with something that left the skin pale and smooth without a single scar, as though the hair had been coaxed away rather than cut. Around her wrists and ankles, thin wires were wrapped in tight coils. Each coil connected to another with a knot of thread dyed a deep brown red. The wires bit into the skin just enough to leave deep channels, and in those channels a faint residue of some fine powder clung, almost invisible until light struck it. The third girl was still a stranger. Where her teeth should have been carved animal bone had been set into the gums. Not as crude replacements, but shaped and polished to mimic the teeth of different species. A fox's canine here, a deer's molar there, arranged to form a jawline that was part human, part animal, but matched perfectly in size. Each tooth had been drilled through its root and strung with a thin silver thread that ran under the gums like a hidden net. The gums themselves were lined with tiny punctures so evenly spaced they could have been measured by a craftsman's tool. On her back, a series of shallow, precise cuts formed the outline of something like a family crest. But the details were unfamiliar. Not a shield or animal, but a set of interlocking shapes that seemed to twist the longer they were looked at. In every case, the bodies had been prepared with a discipline that spoke of long practice. This was not rage or haste. It was work done by someone who understood how to keep the flesh from rotting before the design was complete, how to stop bleeding without letting the subject die until the intended moment. The Harpers had the orchard, the privacy, and the patience to see each variation through to the end. They worked with tools common to any farm: knives, wire, thread, boards, nails. But in their hands, these became instruments for shaping people into parts of a larger puzzle. The pattern was not always obvious in one body alone, but together they built towards something only the maker could truly see. The ledger in the pantry hinted at this. Each entry listed a name, sometimes only a first, followed by a date, then a set of symbols, and finally a number in inches. At first, the inches were thought to be the height of the girls, but they varied too wildly for that. It was only when the marks on the barn beams were compared to these entries that the meaning began to form. The beams were scored with faint, deliberate lines, spaced with exacting precision, each distance matching one of the numbers in the ledger. It was as if each girl's body had provided a measurement for something being built, something far larger than herself, recorded and stored until all the parts were gathered. No one could say how the Harpers chose their subjects, but the variety suggested more than convenience. Some were local, some from towns days away. They came from different ages, different builds, different coloring. What united them was not who they were, but what they could be turned into. A component in the method, a data point in whatever was being assembled in secret. And if the variety was intentional, it meant the Harpers had been looking for qualities invisible to anyone else, traits no one would notice until they were stripped from the living and fixed into place. In the barn's hidden room, the collected pieces lined the shelves, jars with preserved skin panels etched in shallow patterns, braids wrapped in cloth to keep their shape, tiny carved bones sorted into neat rows. Each was labeled not with a name, but with the same crooked star symbols from the ledger, repeated in sequences that might have been instructions or spells or measurements. The air in that room was dry and faintly sweet, a smell like pressed flowers that had been stored too long in a trunk. The method was not just about killing. It was about changing the human form into something that could carry meaning beyond life, as if the body were nothing more than raw material for a set of instructions no one outside the family was meant to read. By the time the orchard had given up all it would, there were 5 girls known and likely more unseen, each a separate chapter in the same unbroken practice. The Harpers had worked for years without a single slip that reached the valley. No child had been found wandering. No one had been discovered half done and breathing. The method left no survivors, and in its cold perfection lay its most disturbing truth, that this was not improvisation, not madness without aim, but a process refined over time, tested and passed between hands in the same way other families might pass a recipe. The orchard was only the storage, the barn was the workshop. And somewhere in the mind of Mrs. Harper, the final design waited for the last measurement to be taken. The ledger was found by accident, though in a house like the Harpers, nothing was truly left to chance. It was hidden behind 3 jars of preserved peaches in the pantry. Jars so old the syrup inside had turned the color of dark tea. The shelf was narrow, the wood warped with age, and when an investigator reached for the rearmost jar, the board flexed just enough for the glass to slip forward. Behind it, where the wall should have been, there was instead a shallow recess no bigger than a bread loaf. In that space lay the ledger. A thick, leather-bound book, the cover rubbed smooth at the corners, its spine cracked from years of being opened and shut with care. The leather smelled faintly of smoke and something sharper, a scent that lingered on the hands of anyone who touched it. The first pages were neat, each entry penned in the same careful hand. The ink a uniform brown that had faded evenly over time. Every line began with a name. Sometimes there was only a first name, sometimes an initial, and sometimes the space was left blank. Beside each name was a date, always in a precise month-day-year format. After that came the strange part, a cluster of symbols unlike any known alphabet, drawn with such consistency that they might have been traced from a template. These crooked stars, intersecting triangles, and looping lines repeated themselves in different combinations, as if each stood for something only the writer understood. The last column held a number in inches, sometimes followed by a fraction. At first glance it could have been the height of a child, but the numbers made no sense in that way. A girl of 8 was marked as 41.34 inches. Another, clearly older, was only 27.12. It was the marks in the barn that gave the inches meaning. On the main support beams, just above the reach of an average man's head, faint knife scores cut into the wood matched the numbers exactly. They were not carved with the randomness of tally marks. Each was clean, precise, and evenly spaced, as if the beam itself had been turned into a ruler for a project far larger than the building that held it. When the ledger and the beams were compared side by side, the truth began to take shape. Each girl's body had yielded a measurement, and these measurements had been preserved as faithfully as any crop yield or livestock record. The deeper into the book one turned, the stranger the entries became. Later pages held not just symbols, but small, detailed drawings of patterns cut into skin. Spirals intersecting lines, tight grids that wrapped around the outline of a limb or rib cage. In some cases, the drawings included notes about how deep a cut should go before the flesh would scar without infection, or how long a braid could be removed from the scalp before the root's texture changed. These were not the frenzied scrawls of a mind unraveling. They were instructions, and they were written in the same calm, practiced script as the shopping lists kept in the front of the book, where Mrs. Harper had noted how many jars of beans or sacks of flour were needed for winter. Near the middle of the ledger, one page was darker than the rest, the paper stiff and slightly translucent, as if soaked through at some point. The symbols on that page were arranged in a perfect square, each corner marked with the same 5-pointed star, and in the center was a number circled twice, 5. The ink was heavier there, pressed so hard into the page that it left an impression on the sheet beneath. The significance of the number was never confirmed, but it matched the number of flat stones behind the barn. In the back of the ledger, the entries grew sparser, the handwriting slower, as though the work was nearing completion. There were gaps between dates, months of nothing followed by a sudden burst of names and measurements. The final entry was the most unsettling. There was no name, only the date, August 3rd, 1891, and the inches, 33.14. Beneath the measurement was a single, unbroken line drawn from one edge of the page to the other. It was the only entry without symbols, as though the writer knew no further notation was needed. The ledger did more than record. It revealed the Harpers' thinking, the way their minds had bent around the idea that the human body could be broken down into a set of usable parts, each with a value, each with a place in a larger whole. It was the language of the method stripped to its essentials, cold and unblinking, with no sign of doubt. That it had been kept in the pantry, behind jars of fruit meant to sweeten the winter, was perhaps the clearest sign of how the family lived. Cruelty and sustenance stored side by side, one feeding the other, each preserved for the moment it would be needed again. The neighbor's boy had been no more than 14 when he first heard it, a sound that carried thin and trembling through the stillness between the orchard rows. It came on a night when the clouds hung so low they brushed the ridge, and the wind from the valley never reached the barn. At first he thought it was an animal, maybe a trapped lamb or a stray cat, but there was something in the tone, the pauses, the soft catch at the end of each note, that told him it was human. He was too far to see, crouched on the far side of the fence, but he could hear the faintest rise and fall of crying. It was not loud enough to wake the house, not frantic enough to carry down the road. It was steady, restrained, almost as if the voice had learned that loud sounds only brought worse things. The crying lasted through that first night, fading only near dawn. By the second evening it returned, weaker but still there, wrapped in the muffled stillness of the barn walls. The boy, though frightened, stayed close enough to hear. He swore later it was always the same voice. Small, female, never shouting for help. Sometimes there were long silences, broken by sudden sharp breaths, like someone startled awake from pain. On the third night the voice was barely more than a whisper, the sound of air moving over dry lips. And then, near morning, it stopped entirely. The boy thought she had fallen asleep at last, but in the days after the barn remained closed and no sound came again. He might have left it at that, a secret to keep or forget, if not for what he saw the following Sunday. While the Harper men were at church, Mrs. Harper moved between the barn and the old trough behind it. Steam rose from the water, though the day was cool, carrying a metallic tang that seemed too sharp for simple boiling. She worked with her back to the orchard, her hands submerged in the steaming water for long stretches before lifting something pale and limp onto the edge. She was quick, but the boy caught a glimpse of a small, narrow arm, the skin marked in even rows of tiny, dark points. The arm bent at the elbow, then dropped back into the water as if it had no weight at all. From the barn, the sound of wood shifting came slow and deliberate. It was the kind of sound made when something heavy is dragged across the floor. She left the trough and returned moments later with a long strip of cloth, lowering it into the steaming water until it darkened and clung to whatever lay beneath. She did not look around. Her movements had the calm efficiency of someone tending to a known task, not improvising, not rushing. The boy knew then that whatever he had heard over those 3 nights had been part of a process, something that had an end long before it began. In the years after, when the orchard was finally turned over and the stones disturbed, one of the bodies matched the memory. She was small, the shallow cuts on her arms still visible in the places where the skin had been preserved. Each cut was perfectly straight, spaced the width of a finger apart, and at every 4th line there was a tiny puncture, as though a needle had been pressed in to anchor the skin during the work. The pattern was uniform, wrapping her arms from wrist to shoulder, the same on both sides. It was not the kind of injury that killed quickly. It was the kind that asked for time, 3 days, perhaps, until the body could no longer hold its shape. The boy never spoke of it until he was grown, and even then his words were halting, his eyes fixed on the ground. He did not try to explain why he had not run for help, why he had not shouted over the fence. In Hollow Road, children learned early that some sounds were not meant to be answered, and on that ridge mercy was not in the air. It was in the hands of those who had the power to stop the suffering, and the Harpers had never once been known to use their hands that way. Long before the Harpers settled on Hollow Road, there were whispers in the northern valleys about a practice carried on in secret by certain families. Not a religion, not quite a superstition, but something older than either passed quietly from mother to daughter. It was called a preservation circle by the few who dared to name it, a gathering of women who believed that a girl's essence could be drawn out in life and fixed into a new vessel, granting the strength of youth, the sharpness of memory, and the endurance of the flesh to those who knew the correct method. There were no books, no sermons, no public rites. It existed only in kitchens with the curtains drawn, in barns at night when the men were away, in the darkened corners of houses where no outsiders stepped. Mrs. Harper's own mother had been named once in connection to it. An older woman in town remembered seeing her slip into the house of another known family after midnight, leaving again before dawn with her sleeves damp to the elbows and her hands smelling faintly of vinegar and iron. The woman had asked no questions then, because she understood that to acknowledge the practice was to invite it into your own life. The preservation circle did not take from its own. It reached outward, toward children whose families could not or would not fight for them, toward the overlooked and the unwanted. Once taken, a girl was not simply killed. She was altered, patterned, and in some way claimed. Her body transformed into something that carried the mark of the one who worked on her. The method was not about mutilation for its own sake. It was a ritual as exacting as laying mortar in a wall or stitching a garment to last a lifetime. Each incision had its place, each removal its timing, each replacement its symbolic meaning. Hair taken on the first day of a new moon would be woven into cords meant to bind misfortune. Teeth pulled in pairs could be carved into tokens to be worn against sickness. The skin, marked with shallow cuts in certain arrangements, was believed to hold a memory of the girl's vitality long after the heart had stopped. If preserved correctly, dried with salt, pressed under glass, or soaked in spirits, that vitality could be drawn back out, used in tinctures and salves, even in the preparation of food. The act was always done in private, but never alone. One worked, another watched, ensuring the order was followed, the sequence unbroken. On Hollow Road, the Harpers adapted this old ritual into something even more methodical. They had the space, the privacy, and the patience to refine it beyond what their mothers and grandmothers had done. The ledger, the beams, the hidden shelves, all of it was part of a single ongoing rite. The orchard provided the perfect ground for burial, the apple trees feeding on whatever was left behind, their fruit thick and sweet, their seeds perhaps carrying more than just the memory of soil. When the trees were in bloom, Mrs. Harper was often seen walking among them alone, her hand brushing the low branches, her lips moving soundlessly. The preservation circle was never mentioned aloud in town, but it was understood, in the way people understand that a river has an undertow even if they never see it. Some elders remembered other valleys where children had gone missing in small waves over the years, never enough at once to cause alarm, but steady like a hidden tide. They remembered the way certain women aged slowly, their hair staying dark long after it should have turned, their skin unlined while their husbands bent with years. No one proved anything. No one tried. The danger was not only in what might happen if the truth were found, but in what it might mean to admit that such a thing could be done so close to home. In the Harpers' hands, the ritual was not a remnant of the past, but a living practice, sharpened and perfected with each girl taken. Every cut, every stitch, every measurement was not an act of cruelty to them, but a necessary step in preserving what they believed should not be allowed to fade. Whether they sought to keep the strength for themselves or to complete some larger design, no one could say. But the orchard, the barn, the stones, the ledger, all spoke to a process that had not been born in that place, only perfected there. And those who knew even a fraction of the old whispers also knew better than to speak them aloud, because some rituals feed on attention, and once you look too closely, you may find the circle has already made room for you. The hidden room did not reveal itself with drama. It waited behind the hayloft wall, thin as a breath, held by two rusted nails that looked like decoration. When the board came free, dust rose in a slow sheet and the narrow chamber opened like a throat. It was not large. A man could stand by turning sideways, but every inch had been measured and used. Shelves ran from floor to beam, spaced with the same exact intervals cut into the barn's posts, and on those shelves sat glass jars with wire bails and tight stoppers, each label inked with the crooked stars from the ledger. In the jars lay rectangles of skin trimmed to a clean edge, braids of hair wound into coils and pinned so they kept their curl, small bones polished until they shone, and teeth sorted by size and carved with tiny letters before a hole was drilled through each root and a fine thread passed in. Some jars held clear liquid while others held syrup the color of old tea. Across one shelf sat 5 shallow trays packed with salt, each tray marked with a symbol that matched the 5 stones behind the barn. In the salt were set cuttings no larger than a matchbox, a square from the inside of a wrist, a crescent from behind an ear, a thin strip from a lip, placed so the ridges and pores could dry without twisting. Twine stretched above the shelves like a slow web, and on it hung tags bearing dates and inches that swayed when the room exhaled. Beside the lowest shelf stood boards pierced with neat rows of holes. Into those holes had been fixed braids capped with beads of applewood scorched on one side, arranged in spirals that matched drawings in the book. At the center of the floor sat a shallow tin-lined basin, ringed with stains like tide marks, each a shade darker than the last. A pipe ran from the basin through the wall to the trough outside, the same trough where steam rose on Sundays. The Harpers had built a loop. Liquid drawn from a body carried by hand returned to the ground that fed their trees and then back again as fruit that hung heavy and sweet. Nothing was rare. Everything was exact. There were knives with points honed to a nail's width, awls with marks scratched at measured depths, wires wound in tight skeins and threads dyed a brown red. A wooden frame leaned against the wall with pegs at fixed intervals. A loom not for cloth, but for spreading skin like a map so lines could be cut along the grain without crossing. Another frame held a hand drill with a limiter set to stop at the thickness of a child's tooth root. Scratches on the handle counted how many times it had been used. On the highest shelf waited small vials that caught the light, each stoppered and sealed with wax. Some were labeled with a single crooked star, others with 2 or 3 in a row as if the dose would increase in steps. The vials did not say what they held, but the color shifted from straw to amber to a dark that was almost black. The room kept its own still climate, dry and faintly sweet, a smell like pressed flowers spoiled by a hidden note of iron. A narrow slit cut high in the wall drew air from the loft, and a folded cloth hung near it to be wetted when weight was needed in the air. Even the light was managed. A square of oiled paper let in a weak glow that showed detail without heat. This was a place built for long work done in small movements. It explained the quiet of the ridge more than any grave. It showed why there was no blood on the barn floor, why no tools lay scattered, why no names were spoken. In this plan, names were not useful. In this room, a body became parts, parts became measures, and measures became a design. The labels matched the beams outside, the inches echoed the ledger, the trays mirrored the stones. Mrs. Harper could stand here and reach everything she needed with the same calm hand she used to choose flour in town. Her steps would be counted, her breath held and released to a rhythm learned from a mother who learned it from another. The sons would bring what was asked for and no more. The father would hold the frame steady while lines were made. While the valley prayed at the hour of service, here the loop would close and open until the room itself seemed to breathe. A person could stand inside this space and feel each shelf say that the order was good in itself. The jars said keep, the frame said measure, the tags said remember, the basin said return. And so the orchard was fed, the barn stayed clean, and the house remained a place where the table was set on time. To the outside world this looked like virtue, to the room it was fuel. The hidden chamber held not rage but purpose, not noise but an ethic. If there was prayer here, it was the way a hand paused over a tool until breath matched the memory of the last perfect cut. When the board was pushed back into place and the nails tapped in, the wall returned to a quiet face and the ridge settled again, holding its secrets the way the glass held its charges, tight and clear and waiting for the next measured step. Now, it was the last stone at the far end of the row, the one nearest the oldest apple tree that held the most tightly kept secret. When the ground was broken there, the air that rose was colder than the season should have allowed, carrying a faint sweetness that did not belong in a grave. The cloth bundle was heavier than the others, the weight uneven, shifting as it was lifted, and the fabric was stitched so tight it might as well have grown into itself. When the first seam was cut, what emerged was not immediately recognizable as a face. The skin was covered by a crude mask made from coarse cloth, sewn directly into the flesh along the jawline and hairline with black thread that pierced both skin and fabric, pulling them together so there was no space between. The stitches were neat, precise, and uniform, each placed with the same distance between, as if measured with the edge of a nail. The mask had no mouth opening, only a narrow slit at the eyes, and even there the cloth was worn thin but not cut away. So the girl beneath would have seen the world as a blur of light and shadow until she no longer saw at all. Her fingers were gone. In their place, carved wooden replicas had been fitted into the skin, each joint shaped to match a human knuckle, each fingertip rounded and smoothed as if from years of handling. The wood bore faint traces of ash. The surface darkened in thin streaks that stopped at the carved creases as though they had been passed quickly through flame and then cooled in water. The wrists were wood-met flesh bound in fine copper wire, wound tight enough to bite but not cut, the ends of the wire hammered flat into the skin as if to hold the false fingers in place. The joints moved slightly when the hands were lifted, the wooden segments clicking faintly like beads sliding on a string. The rest of the body bore the same deliberate work. Along her legs, shallow grooves had been cut in parallel lines from thigh to ankle, filled with a fine white powder that had hardened into the flesh. In some places, the powder had flaked away, leaving narrow channels like dried riverbeds. Across her chest was a stitched pattern of interlocking circles, each ring no larger than a coin. The thread dyed a deep brown red and tied off at exact intervals so the knots formed their own smaller pattern. At the center of the circles over the heart, the skin had been carefully removed and replaced with a piece of thin, translucent parchment, sewn into place so precisely it lay flush with the surrounding flesh. Through the parchment, something dark could be seen. Perhaps the heart itself, perhaps something else entirely. But the surface had been painted with a symbol in a hand so steady it seemed impossible it had been done on living skin. The hair was braided in a single long rope, thicker than any natural braid could be. And when it was unwound, it was found to be made not just from her own hair, but from strands taken from others, woven together so tightly that they could not be separated without cutting. The braid was coiled and nailed to a board kept in the hidden room, each nail capped with a bead of scorched applewood, each bead carved with one of the crooked stars from the ledger. The coil fit perfectly into an empty space on the wall, a space that had been waiting. It was clear from the precision of the work that she had been the last in the sequence, or at least the last needed for this phase of it. Her inches matched the final mark carved into the barn beam, the one with no symbols in the ledger, only the unbroken line. The fifth stone had closed the loop, and whatever the Harpers had been building, whether an object, a design, or something unseen, had reached a kind of completion. The fact that she had been masked, her mouth sealed away, her fingers replaced, suggested she had been meant to be silenced entirely, not just in life but in whatever the Harpers believed came after. Her body was less a person than a vessel, sealed and bound, stripped of her means to touch or speak, yet made into something the Harpers could keep as their own. When the work on her was done, she had been wrapped with the same care as the others and placed beneath the apple tree's oldest roots, where the ground was firm and the shade deep. The tree above bore sweeter fruit than any in the orchard, fruit the Harpers never sold and rarely shared, fruit they sometimes left to fall and rot where it lay, as though it were not meant to be taken from the soil that fed it. And when the grave was opened at last, it was not just the body that was uncovered, but the sense that the orchard itself had been holding its breath for years, waiting for someone to disturb what it had been made to hide. The fifth grave was not only an end. It was a marker that something the Harpers had been working toward had been finished, and that whatever it was, it had never left the ridge. When the arrests came, they were quiet, without the spectacle the crimes deserved. The sheriff from the valley rode up Hollow Road with 2 deputies and a wagon, the kind used for transporting livestock. The Harpers did not resist. The father stepped out first, his hands already clasped behind his back, his expression flat, as if the trip to town were only another chore to be done before supper. The sons followed in silence. Mrs. Harper emerged last, her apron clean, her hair pinned, her eyes settling on the sheriff in a way that made him look down without meaning to. The news spread through the valley faster than the wagon could carry them. But when the trial began, the silence was startling. There were no parents demanding justice, no siblings to point and name what had been done. Those who might have spoken stayed home, some out of fear of the Harpers' reach, fear of what might still be buried, fear that the preservation circle whispered about for decades would turn its attention toward their own families. Others out of something closer to reverence, an unspoken belief that the Harpers' work was part of a larger order that was not to be interfered with. In court, the evidence was spoken of in fragments. The ledger was shown, but the symbols were called marks of unknown origin, and their meaning left untouched. The bodies were mentioned only as human remains, the precision of their condition flattened into the language of official record. The hidden room in the barn was reduced to a storage space containing various items, and the prosecutor did not describe the jars in detail, perhaps for the jury's sake, perhaps for his own. The Harpers gave nothing. The father answered only when directly asked, his words short and stripped of anything resembling feeling. The sons spoke even less, their eyes fixed on the wall. Mrs. Harper did not testify. She sat still, her hands folded in her lap as if the outcome were of no importance. When the verdict came, it was not the one the valley had whispered for. The charges were narrowed, the sentences light enough that the eldest son might see freedom before his hair turned gray. The mother and father were to serve separate terms, the details sealed from public record. When the wagon carried them away, the road was lined not with townsfolk jeering, but with those who turned their faces as it passed. A few watched, but their eyes were unreadable, neither pity nor triumph in them. Some crossed themselves, though whether it was to ward off the Harpers or to offer them protection was impossible to tell. The orchard left untended stood in still rows behind the barn, the 5 stones lying flat as before. By the time the leaves turned, the ridge was empty. The barn doors swung in the wind, the hidden room locked away behind its false wall, the trough dry. No one went up to claim the property. The trial had ended, but its truth had been buried under the same quiet that had kept the Harpers safe for so long. In the valley, people spoke less of what had happened than of how quickly it had been made to pass. And those who had known even a fraction of the truth kept their voices low, because some things once named aloud could not be pushed back into the dark. The Harper farm did not rot or collapse the way abandoned places often do. It stood as if waiting, the roofline unbroken, the windows intact, the orchard pruned by no one, yet still growing in its careful rows. The grass behind the barn thickened until the 5 stones were half swallowed, but their straight line never shifted. Children from the valley dared each other to climb the ridge, to creep close enough to touch the barn door and then run back down. Some returned laughing, others pale and quiet, unwilling to explain why they would not try again. A few swore that in the days after their visit they woke with strange marks on their skin, faint shapes like the impressions of threads or the ridges of a carved bead pressed into their flesh. The marks faded quickly, but the memory did not. The orchard took on a new life without hands to tend it. The fruit grew heavier, the skins thicker, and the seeds inside darker than before. Those who dared to taste it said the apples were sweeter than any they'd eaten, but the sweetness left a bitter edge in the throat that water could not wash away. Some said it was just the soil rich from generations of planting, but others avoided the fruit entirely, muttering about what had gone into the ground to make it grow so well. When the wind came from the ridge, it sometimes carried the faint smell of vinegar and iron, as though the air had soaked too deeply into the barn walls to ever give it up. From time to time, strangers came, people from other counties or even farther, asking where the Harper place was, speaking in quiet tones about the trial they'd read of or heard in passing. The townsfolk would give vague directions or none at all. It wasn't protection for the Harpers anymore. It was something closer to self-preservation, a need to keep the ridge and its orchard from being stirred by too many footsteps. Everyone understood, though no one admitted aloud, that the Harpers were gone, but their work had not truly ended. A method so exact, so complete, did not simply vanish when its makers left. It left marks, not just on bodies, but on the land, on the air, on the minds of those who had stood too close. In winter, when snow covered the stones, the ridge looked almost clean, but the stillness was sharper there, the kind that pressed against the ears until it became a hum. Travelers passing through said the place seemed to hold its breath as they walked by, only to let it out when they were gone. Some spoke of glimpsing movement in the orchard at dusk, shapes too small to be men, too quick to be deer. The shapes would vanish when looked at directly, but the impression of being watched would follow down the road. No one built on the Harper land. No one asked the county to auction it. It sat outside the flow of property and inheritance, a place the law seemed content to forget. But forgetting did not erase it. In the valley, the Harpers became a kind of warning told to children, not about monsters, but about people who could be perfectly ordinary in the open and unspeakable in the dark. And when the warnings were told, they were always followed by a silence, as if to leave space for the listener to feel the truth settle in. On Hollow Road, the orchard kept growing. The barn stayed closed, and the 5 stones waited under their cover of grass, holding what they had been given as if time could not touch it. In the decades that followed, the story of Hollow Road moved in and out of public sight like fog over low fields, never gone, never fully clear. The ledger resurfaced first, pulled from an estate trunk at a county auction in 1919, its calm script more disturbing than any rumor. A clerk in Montpellier copied the pages and argued that the symbols mattered, that the inches were a system, not scraps. His memo slept until a string of missing girls along the river, and then the state passed a simple rule with sharp edges. Every report of a missing child must be telegraphed across county lines within the hour, with height, scars, and marks noted in plain words. It was called a registry and practice, and it grew into law, the first answer the valley gave to the orchard's silence. Other changes followed. Undertakers were told to record the true condition of a body, not soften the notes. County barns were inspected for concealed rooms. None of it brought the girls back, but the gaps that once swallowed people began to narrow. The memorial rose slowly, as if the ground wanted patience before it was marked. In 1934, a small stone was set near the base of the ridge, and hard to see from the road, carved with 5 thin lines and no names. People left apples there in late summer. In winter, someone always brushed the snow from its face. The ledger sat under glass at the state library, open to the page with the 5 pointed stars and the circled number. Some children looked away. Others pressed close until a teacher touched a shoulder and guided them on. A pamphlet on the table said that order without mercy is a mask, and that neat hands can hide a wound as easily as heal it. Years later, sealed papers from the trial were opened. A deputy's notes described the hidden room in flat words, and then, on the last line, admitted he dreamed of jars for weeks and woke up tasting vinegar. A midwife's letter, unsigned but careful, named Mrs. Harper's mother and the preservation circle not as legend but as a lesson she had refused. A scrap from the prosecutor matched the inches in the ledger to the scores on the beams and drew one long line beside the date of the 5th grave. None of these pages changed the verdict, but they stripped away the comfort that the law had simply missed the truth by accident. The truth had been seen and filed and set aside because it fit too neatly into a life people wanted to keep unchanged. With time, hard thinking took root. Evil does not roar, the historians wrote. It balances ledgers and labels jars. It ties back hair and wipes a table clean. It finds a loop so tidy you mistake it for virtue. The Harpers had not invented anything new. They had shown how far a ritual could travel when dressed in neat habits. The orchard was a factory for forgetting. The barn was a temple to control. The house was a face set for company while the work went on behind the teeth. People from the ridge learned to distrust any order that asked for silence as its price. In the end, there's little to see. A stone salted by rain, the faint grooves where the barn doors wore the threshold. Smooth, but the legacy lives in the habits that shifted. Teachers counting children twice before dismissal. Neighbors walking each other home after late meetings. A sheriff who keeps an open book on his desk. A librarian who watches which pages make a student's hands shake. Clerks learned to ask twice, and pastors kept their doors open for frightened voices at the edge of town. Families tell their children that order is good only when it protects the weak. Anything else is a system waiting to be fed. What remains is the question most would rather not hold. How many times is a method like theirs waiting behind tidy faces? How many kitchens and barns praise order while carving at the people inside them? The jars are gone. The ledger rests under glass. The orchard breathes like any field. But the loop they built can start anywhere a town chooses calm over witness. This story ends with a law, a memorial, and papers unsealed, but it does not end inside us. We walk past the stone. We read the inches, we hear the bell from the valley, and we decide if we will look away. What do you think? Could this happen again?